When George turned 62, he began to notice subtle but persistent changes in his well-being. His morning walks, once a refreshing ritual, started to feel more laborious. He found himself short of breath on slight inclines and felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. Curious and slightly concerned, he checked his blood pressure with a home monitor his son had given him months earlier. The numbers stared back at him, higher than they should be. A visit to the doctor confirmed it. His blood pressure had been steadily climbing. "It's common at your age," the doctor said, handing him a prescription. But George wasn't interested in masking the problem. He wanted to understand it. High blood pressure after 60 is not always a sign of illness, in the traditional sense. Often, it's the body's way of saying that it's under strain. Extra weight, persistent stress, lack of movement, and an unbalanced diet all add tension to the blood vessels. Over time, the heart has to work harder to push blood through stiffened arteries, and that effort is what we read as high blood pressure. The numbers on the monitor don't appear out of nowhere. They're the result of years of habits, circumstances, and choices, many of which feel too small to matter until they accumulate. George began reading about natural ways to lower blood pressure. What surprised him most was how much control he actually had. The pills could help, yes, but they weren't a cure. They managed symptoms, not causes. If he truly wanted to feel better, to move freely and live without fear of the next number on the screen, he needed to address the root of the issue. But the good news? That root was within his reach. No need for anyone who wants to feel more in control, more alive, and less dependent on pills and prescriptions. We'll explore simple, proven steps to lower more salt than he thought possible. The first few days were odd. Everything tasted slightly flat. But then something happened. His taste buds started to wake up. He began to notice the sweetness in carrots, the nuttiness of whole grains, the natural saltiness in a slice of cheese. Food, stripped of its extra salt, had a new kind of clarity. Sodium wasn't the only culprit. Sugar, too, had played a quiet but dangerous role. George had a long-standing habit of stirring a heaping spoon of sugar into his morning coffee and reaching for cookies in the afternoon. But sugar spikes insulin, promotes inflammation, and disrupts the way blood vessels relax. Slowly, George replaced these habits. He added a drizzle of honey to his tea instead of sugar, and kept a small bowl of berries nearby when he wanted something sweet. The natural and a couple throughout the afternoon became his new normal. It wasn't about forcing anything, it was about gently shifting habits. Within a few weeks, George noticed a difference. His head felt clearer. The pressure behind his eyes had eased, and the numbers on the monitor began to stabilize. It wasn't magic. It was food. Ordinary. Powerful. And finally working for him, not against him. George stood in the produce aisle, holding a ripe avocado in one hand and a bunch of spinach in the other. A month ago, he might have passed them by in favor of something quicker, easier, maybe a frozen dinner or a box of crackers. But now, armed with curiosity and a growing sense of agency over his health, he was seeing food not just as sustenance, but as medicine. Not the bitter kind, but the kind that could heal gently, meal by meal. He'd read that certain nutrients played a direct role in relaxing blood vessels and supporting healthy circulation. Potassium was one of the most powerful. It helps balance sodium levels in the body and eases tension in the walls of the blood vessels. Bananas were the obvious choice, but George discovered plenty of alternatives. Roasted potatoes with the skin, fresh spinach in his omelets, and slices of creamy avocado on whole-grain toast. These became staples, not because he had to, but because they began to taste like care. Magnesium, another key player, was found in foods George had once overlooked. Now, he scooped a handful of unsalted almonds into a jar he kept on the kitchen counter. He started adding buckwheat to his soups and switching out instant cereal for steel-cut oats. Each small swap was a quiet step toward strength. Then came a bigger surprise: omega-3 fats. He'd always assumed fat was the enemy, but not this kind. Found in salmon, mackerel, flax seeds, and chia seeds, omega-3s help reduce inflammation and keep the heart's rhythm steady. George wasn't ready to cook fish every week, but a spoonful of ground flax in his morning oatmeal was simple enough. And to his delight, he liked the nutty flavor. Garlic was another revelation. A friend mentioned it at a neighborhood gathering, calling it nature's blood thinner. George didn't need much convincing. He started adding half a clove of raw garlic, minced and mixed into salad dressing or yogurt, every other day. The first time, George had never been. Slowly, without fanfare, 10 minutes turned to 20, then 30. His breath deepened. His legs felt stronger. Most importantly, his mind cleared. Movement, it turned out, wasn't about pushing limits. It was about consistency. Walking gently raised George's heart rate, increased circulation, and helped his blood vessels stay flexible. It wasn't intense, but it was regular. And that, doctors agreed, was what mattered most. He wasn't training for a marathon. He was training for life, longer, steadier, and more joyful. On rainy days, he moved indoors. A simple yoga routine from a video on his tablet became a favorite. No chanting, no headstands, just slow stretches that eased his back and opened his chest. Your body doesn't care if you call it exercise, as long as you keep it moving. George now understood what she meant. He didn't need to lift weights or count reps. All he needed was a reason to keep going. A walk with a neighbor, a stroll after dinner, a quiet dance when no one was watching. And with each day, the numbers on his blood pressure monitor began to shift. Subtly, steadily. But more than that, George felt different. More grounded, more capable. The stiffness in his joints lessened. His sleep improved. His steps, once cautious, now carried purpose. Movement had become his medicine. Not a bitter pill, but a daily act of kindness to himself. No force, no guilt, just the simple decision to keep going, one step at a time. George used to think stress was just part of life, something you managed by keeping busy, staying distracted, or pushing through. He had spent decades working, raising a family, meeting expectations. Slowing down in retirement hadn't silenced the pressure. In fact, the quiet sometimes made his worries louder. Finances, health, the future. It all echoed in his mind like a low hum. And it showed up in his body. Tight shoulders, restless sleep, and, inevitably, elevated blood pressure. One morning, after a restless night, he sat with a cup of tea and stared out the window. A robin landed on the sill, tilting its head. George watched it for a while. For once, he didn't reach for his phone or flip on the news. He just sat, breathed, and something inside him softened. It was his first real lesson in stillness. He began setting aside 10 quiet minutes each day. No distractions, no agenda, just breathing slowly, in and out. At first, it felt unnatural, but soon he noticed how his shoulders relaxed, how his thoughts slowed, how his chest felt less tight. These simple pauses became anchors in his day. Sometimes he'd listen to soft instrumental music, sometimes the sounds of nature, and other times, just silence. He started writing too, not anything elaborate, just notes in a small notebook. what worried him, what he was grateful for, what he hoped tomorrow might bring. Putting thoughts on paper gave them a place to build, to ask, read, tinker with old radios, or simply sit in the quiet, enjoying the stillness of the house. But after retirement, the lines between day and night began to blur. He'd stay up too late, sleep in too long, and some days skip naps only to doze off in front of the TV. It felt harmless. After all, wasn't retirement meant to be unstructured? But his body disagreed. He began waking with a heavy head, his blood pressure readings creeping upward despite all the changes he'd made. His doctor gently suggested something simple but often overlooked: better sleep hygiene. George scoffed. At first, how could a bit more sleep possibly compete with medication or diet? But, curious as ever, he decided to try. He began by setting a consistent bedtime. It wasn't easy at first. He also stopped keeping his phone on the nightstand. The temptation to scroll through messages or news was too strong. Instead, he kept a small notebook there, jotting down lingering thoughts that might otherwise keep him awake. The bedroom, once a catch-all space, became a quiet retreat. No TV, no clutter, just soft lighting, fresh sheets, and a window cracked open for cool air. Within days, he noticed something unexpected. He began falling asleep faster. His dreams returned, vivid and strange, but oddly comforting. And in the mornings, he woke feeling clearer, lighter. His blood pressure began to level out again, and even his mood seemed more stable. What surprised him most was how much energy he had. Energy that made his walks easier and his patience longer. George also discovered the value of daytime rhythm. He ate meals at roughly the same times, took a short rest after lunch, just 15 minutes with his eyes closed, and resisted the urge to nap late in the day. His body began to trust the pattern. That trust, he realized, was what had been missing. His body didn't want perfection. It wanted predictability. What George learned was simple but powerful. Rest isn't a reward. It's a necessity. Sleep repairs what the day breaks, and a steady rhythm doesn't cage you. It frees you to live with more ease, more clarity, and more resilience. George had long believed that a little drink now and then was harmless, especially a glass of red wine with dinner or a bit of whiskey to help the nerves. And cigarettes, though he'd quit decades ago, still haunted his memories as symbols of youth, rebellion, and brief moments of calm. But as he grew more mindful of his health, it became clear that some habits, no matter how familiar, stood in direct opposition to the peaceful life he was building. He didn't want to admit it at first. After all, wasn't one drink a night supposed to be good for the heart? But deeper reading and a heartfelt conversation with his doctor shifted his perspective. Alcohol may briefly relax the blood vessels, but the rebound effect is stronger. Pressure rises, heart rhythm can falter, and restful sleep becomes harder to achieve. George noticed on mornings after even a small drink, his readings were slightly higher, and his mind a little foggier. He didn't cut it out all at once. Instead, he began to experiment. Blood vessels and deprives the function that honored his body, his time, and the years still ahead. Every better choice was a quiet act of self-respect. In the end, lowering his blood pressure wasn't just a medical goal, it was a new way of living, one rooted in care, community, and the simple, powerful belief that it's never too late to begin again.